Thank you very much for your patience and finding seats for people, and welcome to the fourth in our series of 8 programs. You're looking forward to having Dave Luce talk to you about the early history of Stowe, and please note on the way out what we'll have for next week for a talk. Thank you very much. Welcome, Dave Luce.
Well, thank you all and welcome. I hope this talk lives up to the advanced billing, but it certainly looked like we filled the house, and that's great. I'm pleased for that. And first, I'd like to tell you that I owe a debt to the Stowe Historical Society and to the Stowe historians who've written about Stowe's history, specifically Edwin Lang, Ellen Lovejoy Hunter, and Walter J. Bigelow. All of their histories were helpful to me. I also had access to a lot of family history from my uncle, who was a family archivist for many years, and so I got a lot of information from that. First of all, as to the title, you will see that Stowe is written S-T-O-W with a little E at the end. That E was not added until a town meeting in 1838, and my talk precedes that date, and so I will continue to use the S-T-O-W spelling. As to the idea of the frontier, you have to remember that in the very early days, and we'll be talking about that, in many of those times, Stowe did not exist as a town, and so I realized that it's also the frontier. It is an area that we now call Vermont, which was inhabited basically by indigenous people, and they were, frankly, they had been pushed out. We were not a colony, as the early colonists were. The colonies had pushed the indigenous people out, and a lot of them probably came and lived in what for a long time was the frontier. It didn't look like that map at all. The map shows towns and counties, and that was not the case initially. I'm also aware that 2026 will be the 250th anniversary of our nation, and so I felt it was important to talk about the history of both the nation and Vermont as it relates to Stowe specifically, and I'll get into that in considerable detail in a bit. And who am I? I am David Luce, and I am a resident of Waterbury. Never lived in Stowe, but I am a direct relative of a lot of people, and 3 of whom I will introduce to you. Luce's from Stowe that lived here only in Stowe, and you'll meet them a little bit later in my talk. Back up a bit, or move ahead a bit actually. This is an outline, that bold outline, a dark outline, is Stowe as it currently exists. And it is actually the biggest town, I believe, in the state of Vermont by land area, and that's because in the mid 1850s, they gobbled up the towns of Mansfield and Sterling. And I think, I have to think, and by the way, I will use my opinion on occasion where historical fact didn't fill me in with details, but it's never a case where I'm varying from the history, I'm using some of my own common sense. The reason I think they were able to annex, Stowe was able to annex Mansfield and Sterling was because they found the farming on the mountainside pretty difficult to do. Pretty rocky, pretty steep, a lot of forests, and the people that lived up there, many of whom were my relatives on Luce Hill, they found the farming pretty difficult to do. So what I'm suggesting here is that Stowe, which is now the ski capital of the East, was kind of a happy accident of history. This map of colonial America is kind of interesting, and I'd like to point out a few things here. didn't want to do that. So Vermont is here, as we know Vermont to be. It was just a wilderness back then. The other thing that's kind of, it made me think, why was this not a colony in the beginning as the other colonies were? And my opinion had something to do with the fact that we didn't have any coastline. And the European immigrants were coming into places like Boston and New York and the Long Island Sound along the Connecticut coastline. They were coming where it was easiest to get ashore, and we didn't have a shoreline. The other thing that you will notice here, particularly with respect to Maine, for example, Maine says Mass on it. And originally, I call it colony creep, because the colonies took access to land it didn't matter that they owned it or not. They didn't have a lot of control from England, and so they took whatever they felt they wanted. So here you see Mass is part of, or Maine is part of Mass here. Connecticut, it also extends at one time to the Mississippi River. So there was a lot of flexibility in the layout of colonies. The other thing that I will use a narrative device is the timeline idea. And this timeline's pretty sparse, as you can see, but I'm going to fill it in. It's going to be pretty crowded by the time I get done. The first character in my story is this guy, Benning Wentworth. Benning Wentworth was appointed Royal Governor of New Hampshire by King George II, and he's looking around. The other thing you need to know is the colonies were getting terribly overcrowded. They grew from a population in 1650 of about 50,000 to, in 1750, they had 2.5 million people, including slaves at that time, but excluding the indigenous people who had been kind of pushed out by the European immigrants. I think Benning Wentworth is the real scoundrel of the story. I think he did some things that he was the originator of a lot of land and political disputes that happened in the future. In fact, I will try to show you that Vermont was almost totally a product of numerous such disputes. And what I learned from doing this was a lot more Vermont history than I knew before. I was more familiar with American history, but not so much with Vermont history, and I learned a lot in this, putting this presentation together. So the first thing Benning Wentworth does, the first policy he initiates from 1749 to 1764, 15-year period, was this idea of the New Hampshire land grants. You've probably already heard a lot about that. The idea he had, and I think it was a justification for what he did initially, the idea was we were overcrowded, all the colonies were, New Hampshire was no different than anybody else, and he thought, I've got this land to the west of me. There's nobody living there except the indigenous people that, and I'm sure the European immigrants didn't think they counted for very much. And so he said, I think I can go west. And he began this policy of chartering towns. He chartered about, well over 100, I think it was 135 towns in the area of Vermont. He did this for two reasons. One was to improve on the overcrowding situation, but the second thing he did was he sold these lands off to, the chartering of town didn't mean anything for him in terms of personal wealth, but the idea he had was I could sell these lands, 50 acres each. I could get about a whole bunch of acreage out of 123,000 acres of these 6 square mile towns. And he said, I can that will increase my personal wealth. Of course, that idea of selling off land to people that don't even live there yet was kind of dangerous, and it tended to increase the number of disputes of land. These guys, these were charterers, and a lot of them lived in, going back. These charterers lived in rural Connecticut in many cases, in other New England colonies, and they had the idea that they could make money as well. I mean, they bought a property. They didn't intend to move there. In fact, in Stowe, getting way ahead of myself here. Sorry about that. I got this thing, I bought this device, haven't used it a lot, and I'm a little trigger happy, I think. There we go. Oh, I'm also hitting the screen. I gotta avoid doing that. So these guys, the royal rules for charters was that the proprietors who bought into these, they were supposed to move there and develop the land and live there. That was the whole idea of selling the charters. Of course, they understood also that there was this overcrowding problem, and they could sell those charters that they had paid Benning Wentworth for, they could sell them off to other people. And so this whole idea was causing a lot of trouble, setting up a lot of major disputes. And nobody is representing the settlers' interests. I intended to do that. So this, going back to the timeline now, the same time New Hampshire grants problems are going on, we have the French and Indian Wars happening, and this is a national problem. It doesn't affect us a whole lot here, but what is a problem is this is a misnomer, the French and Indian, because it was between France and Great Britain. It was a problem for local settlers insofar as the Indian allies, again, the indigenous folks, some of them living in this area of the wilderness, they're here, they're not happy with the immigrants be moving in, and they decide that it's not safe to go there yet, so we'll stay out of that area. The other thing about this war is Great Britain wins the war, that's going to cause a problem. It's going to cause a problem for the colonies because Great Britain wants to be repaid for the money they spent in fighting this war, and they're going to tax, as we remember very well from a later conflict, they're going to tax the colonies to recover this money. Finally, we begin to get to Stowe. Stowe is chartered in 1763. That doesn't mean, as we learned before, that doesn't mean anybody's going to move here. The charterers, in fact, Stowe had 94 charterers initially. None of them ever came here. But they paid money to get the land, and then they could sell off that land to somebody else. 1764, I will say also, Waterbury was chartered the same year as Stowe, and Waterbury becomes important a little bit later on in my talk. Waterbury, I think, was easier to get to, and I'll tell you why in a bit. And it settled much quicker than Stowe did, and because of geography, and we'll talk about that. Stowe was named after Lord Stowe of England by, I believe, Benning Wentworth. Didn't mean anything, I don't think, to anybody who ever really lived here. Stowe was just a term that he gave for this town. The land disputes intensify. The problem is New Hampshire land grants policy ended. In Great Britain, the Board of Trade in London decided that Benning Wentworth had exceeded his authority. He didn't have the right to sell off the land in the wilderness. Problem is he'd already done a lot of it. The other fact of the matter is that they established the western boundary of New Hampshire permanently as the western shore of the Connecticut River. So he couldn't go into this area. The problem with establishing it as the western shore of the Connecticut River as the boundary for New Hampshire is New York says, ooh, must be our eastern boundary is the western bank of the Connecticut River also. So they decided, hey, Governor Wentworth was making money on this deal. We're going to make some money as well. So they start moving in and they start telling the settlers who've already gone there, tried to live there, that they have to pay a fee again to New York State. And you can imagine, I think we learned something about in a little bit about taxation without representation, and they felt that they were being exploited. And again, as owners started to move in, they began to realize the land they bought might not be developable. Maybe it's swamp, maybe it's a lake, maybe it's a mountain, maybe it's a river. They don't want that land. They want to trade with somebody else for better land. So all of these things amount to a lot of land disputes. Again, I have to reflect back to Benning Wentworth. He was the guy that started all this trouble. So he's out of the picture. New York is in. This is a depiction of the treatment that New York sheriffs got when they tried to evict the Vermonters. Well, they're not Vermonters yet, but they're trying to live in these towns. And New York is coming in and saying, you pay the fee to us now, which they'd already paid to New Hampshire, and the owners are not very happy paying for the same land they already bought. So they needed some help. They got some help. In 1770 now, the Green Mountain Boys are formed, and we might think that they had altruistic motives, but in fact they were, the bunch of them, Ethan Allen, Ira Allen, Seth Warner, they were all landowners in the New Hampshire grants. They bought that property too, and they wanted protection for themselves, and they just happened to be the militia group that was willing to defend the settlers who'd already come there. And here we see at the bottom of that, this is the first accepted Vermont flag. It's a 13-star flag. It's kind of interesting that it represents the colonies and not Vermont yet. But anyway, okay, here we go. Next major national situation is the Revolutionary War. Only the colonies are involved now. You know, remember they've got the dispute with Great Britain. They are ready to foment rebellion, obviously, in what they did. And Vermont wasn't very much involved, or I mean, the area we call Vermont, which was still a wilderness, was not very much involved because they weren't part of this colony situation. They didn't have the big fight with Great Britain at the time. But the Green Mountain Boys got into it anyway. And you may remember they go up and knock on the door of Fort Ticonderoga, and Benedict Arnold is with Ethan Allen there. They take over with a bloodless battle, no battle at all, but they take over without bloodshed. They take over Fort Ticonderoga. So and that's the first American victory of the Revolutionary War, which is kind of interesting since Vermont wasn't involved in the war at all, really. We had one battle in Vermont, the Battle of Hubbardton, and the Battle of Hubbardton occurred because the Americans were retreating from Mount Independence when they realized the Brits had installed cannon on the top of Sugarloaf Mountain, and it was overlooking Fort Ticonderoga and overlooking Mount Independence. And so they retreated from Mount Independence with the Brits hot on their heels, and they get to Hubbardton and they have a battle. They lose the battle, but they did slow down the Brits. So that was really our one battle of the Revolution. There was a Battle of Bennington, you may remember, but it was fought in New York State and it never got here anyway, so didn't affect us that much. Now, this is a depiction of the British-led Indian raid on South Royalton. South Royalton, why would they invade that? Well, it was north on the Connecticut River. It wasn't very well defended. We had problems with defense of the frontier. We had forts at Dummer, at Vernon, at Fort Dummer, and there was a fort at number 4 at Charleston, New Hampshire. And those were basically the protection for the colonists north into the area of Vermont. So you can tell from this, the area is still very wild and unsafe. This is 1780, well into the Revolutionary War. We see that the British are fomenting trouble on the frontier. It really pisses off the locals, very frankly. Why would they do this? Because at the same time, they're negotiating with the Vermonters that are here, the people that are here. They're negotiating to become part of Canada. That was their idea. If they were going to lose the colonies, which by 1780 they were thinking we may lose this war, they were trying to convince the people who lived in Vermont to, I did it again, didn't I? Yeah, okay. They were trying to convince the people who lived here to join them in Canada. We weren't a colony, we weren't a state, we were nothing at that point. So, but because of like this raid, because of these kinds of situations, the colonists, the residents in Vermont were feeling threatened. And so the idea that they might join Canada was something that was talked about. It was called the Haldimand Affair, after the Secretary General of Canada, British Secretary General of Canada. It became kind of a scandal because here were these supposedly Americans. They were negotiating with Great Britain. At the same time, the rest of us were throwing Great Britain out of the nation. And that seemed to be upsetting to a lot of people. But you have to remember, the colonists, particularly New Hampshire and New York, were not treating these Americans, well, I call them Americans now, they weren't treating them very well. So what happens? We're very upset with Great Britain. We're not going to join Canada. We're upset with the colonies next door on both sides. They haven't been treating us very well. And so the Vermont Republic established. It's a 14-year-long republic, and we had our own government, our own stamps, our own banks. We had our own, post office, everything, our own currency as well. And we said, we probably don't have to join anybody. And I like this idea. I think Vermont independence is something these days we might think about again. Anyway, that's the end of Great Britain's influence we've said no to them, and they didn't accomplish anything in America, so they're leaving. So the colonies have now formed states, and so they're not pressuring us. They've formed their own states. They don't need us anymore. And so Vermont, the people of independent Vermont decide, what's the point? Maybe we should just become a state, which they do in 1791. They dissolve the Vermont Republic, and who was led in a way by Thomas Chittenden. He was the first governor of this independent state, or whatever maybe he was a president, I don't know, but he was the guy who later became governor of Vermont. We are now the 14th state, which is good and bad. The good thing is we're now protected from all these disputes that were going on with the colonies in Great Britain. That's not a problem anymore. But since we haven't been in existence for very long, and since we were a wilderness for so long, we don't have any infrastructure. We don't have, for example, we don't have any roads. And just to get around is really, really difficult. And you can't communicate very well with your neighbor if they live 6 miles away in a 6 square mile town, but there's no road to get there. And so that became a problem for us. And we were very slow to grow because of that. This is a kind of a fanciful illustration of something called a corduroy road. Maybe you know what they are. They're basically logs laid across the direction of travel, and they're good and they're bad. This one is particularly interesting because presumably it was held up by trees on the bottom of it. I don't think that would ever possibly be happening. But anyway, we didn't even have those. We had 2 major roads in Vermont. We had the Bailey-Hazen Road, which connected Newbury, Vermont with Canada. George Washington instituted the Bailey-Hazen Road, and he thought, this will help get around a little bit. The problem is, it was a military road, and if it goes one way, it can go the other way. And he was afraid that the British were now going to use it to invade Vermont and the colony and the new states. And so he didn't want to allow that to happen, so he threw up that road. Basically, I think what they did is they just cut down trees and laid them across the road, and so nobody could use that road. The early version of the corduroy road, I guess. The other road that we had was the Crown Point Military Road. We had basically these 2 roads. The Crown Point Military Road connected Ticonderoga with Fort No. 4 in Charleston, New Hampshire. And if you understand your geography, and I'm going to do it in the way you look at it, you got Ticonderoga up here, and you got Fort No. 4 down here, a nice connection there. Trouble is, the British built it, and during the Revolutionary War, they defended it. And they didn't want anybody using that road except themselves. In fact, during the war, you may remember, Henry Knox, after Ethan Allen captured Fort Ticonderoga, he went up and they drafted him to go up there and haul the cannon from Ticonderoga to Boston. Again, think of that, Ticonderoga, Boston. Looks like a nice straight trek. He had to haul the cannon in the winter on sleds from Ticonderoga to Albany, which was still a colony, or had been a colony, was now a state. And then he had to go east across Massachusetts to get to Boston. A big L shape there, because we didn't have any roads. Much later, in fact, there was a turnpike road actually from Waterbury to Stowe. Turnpikes were built by individuals. There were plank roads, which was a little better than corduroy roads because they were flatter, but they rotted just as quickly. And the other thing about them, you had to pay to use them. You had to pay the turnpike owner to use them. Sorry about that. Okay, I am now at the point of turning this from the history of the nation and Vermont to a history of a few of the Luce members of my tribe. I'm going to talk about 3 Luce members who were all interesting. They all had interesting backgrounds, and what they did for Stowe I think was important. Again, I thank the Stowe Historical Society for their files and some of their artifacts, and the Stowe historians. And I also need to thank Johannes von Trapp at this point, because I will get into Luce Hill in a little bit, and he gave me the map, which is out in the vestibule for you to look at if you're interested in Luce Hill at all. Adonijah Luce, the patriarch of the Vermont Luces, he moves from Martha's Vineyard to Heartland, Vermont in 1787. The area is safe now. Those early forts were helpful to keep us safe. The first settler of Stowe shows up, Oliver Luce, 1793, and you'll notice I have a 4 after that because, and I'll get into that in a bit. He comes in late February, early March, I believe he came in 1793. I believe his family came, and we'll get into that in a minute, in 1794. This is how they got there. Remember, we don't have any roads. So he's with his oxen his wife Susanna, and his 2 young daughters. He's on his way to Stowe. Remember, we don't have roads. They're following probably the river valleys, old Indian trails perhaps that are still around, and but it's still a long trek. It's about 70 miles, and he's going like this. How long did it take? I don't know. 10 days, 2 weeks probably. He goes only this way as far as Waterbury. Remember I told you Waterbury grew faster than Stowe, and there was, about the time when he arrived there in 1793, there were maybe 50 families in Waterbury. And that's because, in my opinion, again, they followed the river valleys, and they didn't have to go through the woods and trek through these rough trails to get where they wanted. They could follow basically the flat geography of a river valley, and that's how I believe they came. This may look familiar to some of you, and I thank the Stowe Historical Society for making that artifact available to me. This is a smaller sled. After he got to Waterbury, he took this sled and he hauled his family, I think they walked, he hauled the meager belongings they had to Stowe using this thing. Now, the reason I think there's 2 dates here, I believe he probably came in 1793. I bet he built that sled at the time with the idea of how he was going to have to get to Stowe in future. This sled was not built in a day, and he didn't stay in Waterbury very long because he was in a big yank to get to Stowe. There's the 1794 date. And I think that's right, because I think he used that sled in 1794 to get from Waterbury to Stowe. Again, his family's walking, he's hauling a few, that's not a very big sled, he's hauling a few personal belongings on that sled. This is a depiction of what I envisioned the first rough home built by Oliver Luce in 1793, I think. He built this before he brought his whole family. Made sense to me. It's tough living out there at the best of times, and he wanted to go to the forest primeval. That was his vision, and I think he discovered the forest primeval in 1793. It's still pretty crude, but it's a lot better than it chopped down a lot of trees, and they cultivated a little land, and his oxen was helpful in all of that endeavor, and he moved on to this. He built a better home after that, but this was his first home in the forest primeval. This is the Oliver Luce house marker. It's there at the intersection of Stagecoach Road and Route 100, and it has a date of 1793 on it. And I think that's correct too, because I think he built the first house there in 1793. Stowe still uses a date of 1794, but I think those 2 dates are really interchangeable. He needed to get this house done, at least a crude structure, so that his family could come in 1794. And he was in a race with Clement Moody. Clement Moody was trying to be the first settler of Stowe, and I think Oliver was sweating it, because if Clement got there and discovered that he had built this house, he would probably occupy that house, and Oliver would be left out in the cold. And so I think he was racing. That's why he had built the sled. He knew he couldn't go the whole way with his oxen and all his belongings and his family on board through he'd gone up the river valleys, but now he was going through the forest, and it was pretty tough going. So here is Oliver Luce's grave, and at this point, I want to thank the Stowe Cemetery Association, because they do wonderful upkeep of 7 graveyards, and some of them are just family graveyards, and they still maintain these. They cut the grass, they fence the area, they provide great signage, and their record keeping is fantastic. So I was able to count 97 graves with Luce names on them in various Stowe cemeteries. It's a pretty good population of Luces up here. The other thing I point out is when he died, he was 87 years old. And this is at a time when life expectancy was 40 to 50 years old. So it seems to me that all this effort he went to probably did him a lot of good. That was his own gym routine, I think. Okay, the next Luce that shows up is Zimri. Great name, love that name. Zimri Luce, he's a brother of Oliver, and he goes to Mansfield in 1800, age 42, which I think, again, in a minute, you'll understand why I think that age was significant. Why didn't he live near his brother Oliver? I think Oliver was happy in the forest primeval. He was happy living on his own. He didn't need any family members around him. So Zimri went to live in Mansfield. Again, why I find Mansfield important to this story, because Mansfield exists for another almost 50 years before it goes out of existence. Now, the legend about Zimri is that Zimri decides that he doesn't have enough food for his family for the winter. I don't know if this is the first winter, second winter, whatever, doesn't matter. He decides he doesn't have enough food. And you don't go next door to your neighbor and borrow enough food to get you through the winter. They don't have enough either. So he says, I have only one choice. I got to go back to Heartland. We don't know how he got to Heartland and back, but he made a trip of about 170 miles, round trip. Maybe he had a horse. Still, I'm trying to envision packing enough flour on a horseback with you on it as well to get you back to Stowe with your sacks of flour intact. I don't know how he did that. I think it's pretty admirable. And you wonder, did he even have second thoughts? And I don't think he had second thoughts. I think he felt the survival of his family depended on his doing exactly what he did. And he's gone. The kids are left on their own. And the wife, I don't know, there was a wife, Mary, but she was there with the kids, and they have probably had some meager food that he left for them, but probably not enough because he was already short. So the family survives, I would imagine, on perhaps wild animals, perhaps plentiful wild onions, which we knew grew in the area. I don't imagine at that point in time they had much in the way of crops. It must have been pretty difficult going for a while. This is Zimri's grave site, and again, I point out the wonderful signage that the Stowe Cemetery Association provides for people. This Thomas Luce Cemetery is adjacent to the event field near the top-notch tennis academy. You can walk down to this from the main road. There is a gate there, but you can get to this cemetery, and Zimri is buried here. And he was age 84. And I tell my kids, I said, this Luce gene's pretty good. We pass on good stuff. We stay around a long time. Maybe that's a good, maybe it's bad, I don't know. Okay, one more Luce I'm going to point out to you is Ivory. Great name. At one time, I think somebody wanted to name me Ivory, and I think I'm just as glad they didn't. But it's an interesting name, and he was a son of an Ivory. He's a nephew of Oliver, and he came with his wife Riley in 1806, and they were 24 at the time. They decided to live on Luce Hill, And this is a map. Again, I thank Johannes von Trapp, and there's a copy out in the lobby that you maybe be able to see. I'm going to have to point out a few things on this map to you. I'm going to do that by magnifying it. First of all, the information in the orange circle there, it says Ivory Luce, son of the first Ivory, born in 1782, settled here about 1806. He's a veteran of the Battle of Plattsburgh, War of 1812, and he was a representative of the town of Mansfield. And that's going to play into my story in a minute. But here's some roads. You got Barrows Road is that yellow dotted line. Luce Hill Road is the orange straight line, almost straight. It goes beyond Trapp Hill Road. And the other thing I would point out, that is the line of the town of Mansfield, which was still a town at that time. So Ivory is living now in the town of Mansfield on Luce Hill. This is not Ivory and Orilla at age 24, obviously. I would imagine parents of 10 children in the rough conditions they were living in, they were lucky to look so good. They provided their sons, and they had 10 children. They provided their sons with land to build homes in Mansfield on Luce Hill. Ornery, Ivory was known as an ornery cuss. He, and I'll get into that in a minute, you'll learn what this guy's all about. He threatened bodily harm to an Elijah Town who was promoting the idea of dissolution of the town of Mansfield. And he was even a representative at the legislature. But Ivory did not want to dissolve this town. He wanted to remain in legislature very badly. And I'll get into that in a minute. But this is the cemetery on Luce Hill, which contains the graves of Ivory and Orilla. And it's really a family cemetery. And several of their children are buried there as well. You can get to this by driving up beyond Luce Hill, beyond Trapp Hill Road. Keep going up about a half a mile. You can park on a road called the Hall Road on the right-hand side, and you walk into the woods, and it's been mowed. As I say, the Cemetery Association maintains these cemeteries very, very well, and they've cut a path through the woods. You walk down that path a little bit, and you'll get to this Ivory Luce Cemetery, the old Ivory Luce Cemetery, one of the 7 in Stowe. One of the other 7 is called the South Luce Hill Cemetery. So here's Ivory's gravestone. Died at 88. Amazing man. This is a poem which by a man named Samuel Slayton Luce. Can't get rid of that Luce name. It's everywhere. He's a grandnephew of Oliver Luce, and I'd like to read this to you because it tells you what kind of a guy Ivory was. To return, oh boy, I did it again. Sorry, folks. Just as I get to the end here, I messed up. Okay, I'm going to read from the screen. To start to our subject again. Mr. Brown, who lived, oh boy, did it again. Mr. Brown, who lived in this bit of a New England village, where at all might, with hope, to an office aspire. for the least in this place wasn't less than a squire. Thus it chanced that our hero on a fine autumn day to a seat in assembly was making his way. His toilet, I'm told, was his all and his best, straw hat and toe pants without coat or vest. The distance was 25 miles, made on foot, with feet that were guiltless of shoe or boot. Arrived at the Capitol where he took his seat, with members in broadcloth that couldn't be beat. Some shrank from his touch, as they would from a snake, exclaimed in disgust, "There's sure some mistake," while others, inclined to waggish and smart, must knowingly winked other members apart. One said, "Mr. Brown, I hope not to offend, but had your town no one better, quite proper to send?" Said Brown, "There's plenty that's better, I guess." But stranger, the fact that they hadn't got clothes. That concludes the slide, so I won't make any more mistakes, but I do want to make a final comment. First time, proud of the independence demonstrated by those earliest settlers who fought against the power from the adjoining colonies, from the Crown, and from the Continental Congress, who all tried to undermine their intention of early Vermonters to succeed. To me, it represents the best of the spirit of the state and of the individual people. And although I have spoken about only 3 Luce family members that I know from family history to be true, I understand all the early settlers experienced hardship that I can barely imagine, and I have great admiration for their resilience and perseverance, willing to do whatever it took to not only survive, but to thrive in an unforgiving time and environment. Thank you. I'm glad to answer any questions you might have. If we get into too much history, I might be a little askance, but I'll do the best I can.
I've got the microphone.
Okay. The small graveyard, that Ivory Luce is buried in, off the Hall Road or near the Hall Road. There are 7 or 8 stones there, but I always thought that the little stones were footstones and not additional people. Is that possible?
There are other stones there. They represent other family members of Ivory and Arilla. I don't know if that answers your question, but it is a family, basically a family plot. It's very close to the house they lived in. And that originally, when I first came back from the Navy and went up there in the 90s, basically it was just stones, and the grass was very high, and it was hard to find these stones. But it says on the gravesite at the Ivory Luce Cemetery, it does say that there are several sons as well buried there. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, right over here. Right in.
Hi, I'm curious how we got from Luce to the name Stowe. You said it was a person from Stowe. How did we get the name Stowe if Luce was the first settler? Just curious.
Okay, Stowe was named before Oliver Luce showed up. It was chartered in 1763, but it wasn't settled until Oliver showed up in 1793. But the name Stowe, I thought I mentioned it, maybe I didn't, came from Lord Stowe of England. And as my understanding is, when Wentworth chartered these towns, he gave them names. And he called that one Stowe, S-T-O-W, because it was based on this Lord Stowe from England. And that's how it got its name. It didn't get named Luce or anything like that because of a first settler. That had nothing to do with it.
Right here.
Thank you, that was inspiring. How long did it take after the few Luces started their settlement before Stowe actually got settled by numerous families?
Well, that's a good question. Obviously, the first settler was 1793. The next Luce that shows up, at least as my recollection, was in 1800. So I'm assuming there were people settling all that during that period, especially when somebody starts the movement to Stowe, it continues and more people will come. And as it gets a little easier to get to, more will come. So, yeah.
I'm part of the Moody family, and years ago, Ed Rose, the Stowe historian, told me the story that Moody and Luce met in a pub in Waterbury Center and waged a bet who was going to be the first. And Luce beat Moody by half a day, and what we have in our Stowe history book is that Luce got here with his family on the 16th of April, 1794, and Moody got here on the 17th of April. And according to Barbara Barra, that someone came the year before, not only Mr. Luce, but another name, which I can't tell you right now without going back and looking, and built some structures for those families. Now, the question I have for you, do you know, did Luce buy the land, or was it given to him as a military, grant? Do you have any idea how he acquired the land?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how any of these early settlers actually acquired land. If they had been proprietors, they bought land somewhere in folks in the town of Stowe. What happened when they formed these 6 square mile towns is they divided them into 50-acre lots, and they sold them off to proprietors who came or didn't come. In the case of Stowe, they didn't come at all. None of the proprietors came. How Oliver Luce acquired this property, there must be a record in the Stowe records, but I do not know how he acquired, or how any of the other settlers actually acquired their property. I mean, we are now at a time when there is statehood. There probably is beginning to come a legal way to acquire property, but I don't know how physically that happened, or how the original settlers did it.
I have a deed that goes back to 1803, where there's 182.
Can you give me the mic?
We have a mic. Here we go.
Hi there. I have a deed that goes back to 1803 with 100 acres, and I was always given the impression that Moody acquired the land from military service. And at one time, they owned as much as 500 acres in Stowe. But I've always been curious as to how Luce got here and how the land was acquired, but you don't know.
The best I can tell you is that I think he realized that his land was at risk if he didn't get there first. And I think he really was in a race. At best I can determine from all the records I've read, he was racing to get there. And as you point out, Moody just beat him by half a day. And that's why I'm very insistent that he didn't stop long enough in Waterbury to build a sled. He was in a hurry, and I think he knew Moody was right on his heels, and he just insisted, I'm going to get there first, and whatever it takes, I'll do it.
You have a question?
I just wondered if you know why they decided to add an E to Stowe. What was the?
Let me get a mic.
No.
Mike?
Okay. I was just wondering if you know why they decided to add the E to Stowe.
I have no idea. I think probably to differentiate it simply from the idea that it was named for this lord in England. But that's not during the period of my talk, so I have no idea what the political ramifications of adding that E were. I suspect we're all very happy that Stowe has an E on the end of it now, but at the time, I don't really know the answer to that.
Other questions?
We got another question.
Yep.
Try this one.
Yep, right there.
Oh, good. I was wondering,
Someone else has a mic and speak. Let's try it. Close to the speaker. And I'll put this one back. We're having feedback problems. Thank you.
They shouldn't disappear, but they do.
Hold it. We got, let's try this question first.
This question's over here, okay.
Speak right up to the end.
I'm wondering what was involved in communicating from the earliest settlers of the Luce family to other Luce members down the coast. You were saying that some of them came from at least 160 miles. And to communicate that they were actually here, just the most basic information, I was wondering what was involved in communication back then.
Well, the best answer I can give you is simply the fact that Adonijah Luce, the patriarch of the family, he moved with his entire family. He had 9 children, and they moved to Heartland from Martha's Vineyard initially. And as best I know, the relatives who show up here first, the 3 that I talk about, 1793 to 1800 to 1806, they all came from basically from Adonijah's family, and they came to Stowe. Obviously, once they're here, they're producing more children. For example, Oliver had came with 2 daughters, but they had a son, Harry, who was born here in Stowe. Didn't live here very long. He moved out of state. I do know that. But all of these families multiply, obviously, and multiply again. And so I don't know that there were other Luces from other parts of New England who might have come here initially. I have no idea about that, really.
Another question?
We got a couple.
In the beginning, very beginning, we only had the Moody family and the Luce family. Do you know if there was much cooperation, interaction between the 2 families in starting this town?
That's a good question. As I pointed out initially, Zimri came and he didn't even live close to Oliver. I mean, Oliver, he lived probably 4 or 5 miles apart, which is significant. And I suspect if you look at the Luce Hill map out there, you will see that everybody lived a considerable distance from their neighbors. They weren't terribly neighborly. And I don't know why that is, except for the fact that you got to grow crops and you got to cut down woods and to build your house. And, you know, times are tough. And I'm not sure that food was plentiful, as I pointed out here. Food was scarce, and you kept it to yourself. And I think, I don't know, other than the fact that they just they needed to survive, and it was a difficult environment to survive in, and they did what they had to do. And I don't think they lived terribly close together as a community. When did Stowe become a real community? I don't know. In 1800, there were only 316 people living in Stowe. And that was 7 years after Oliver showed up. So they didn't come real quickly, and I don't think they lived terribly close together. Question?
Okay, it's 2 o'clock, so let's thank Dave again, and please come down and talk to him if you want further.